Hello, everybody. This is George Gruen at Gruen Guitars, Nashville, Tennessee, July 9th, 2021, for another question and answer session. And I'd also like to say that next week is the NAMM show in Nashville, and we will not be doing a session next Friday because we will be totally 100% total immersion in the NAMM show with thousands of visitors to Nashville for the musical instrument industry. So I'll have plenty to report on it the next week, but next week we will not be doing a question and answer session. But we certainly are today. Also, a bit of commentary. We right now in Nashville are hosting the Chet Atkins Appreciation Society annual convention, although last year there was none, so this is the first one now. It's been 2 years. And I can say that while we are getting plenty of visitors in the store and have been since the lockdown, for about 2.5 months, our showroom was shut, but after that, we've been plenty busy. And we are fully open now and getting as many visitors as ever. Business is strong, but the Chet Atkins convention showed a different side. The attendance is dramatically down, and the hotel that hosts it, the Music City Sheraton, is a convention center hotel. It is a convention hotel in itself with large convention rooms. And they have been very slow for the past year. This is just about their first show in which they have a convention, and it's much smaller than usual. Their restaurant is not fully open, and the staff there is minimal. It is really quite a change. And I can say that it shows that the pandemic is still having dramatic impact. Also, the number of exhibitors showing musical instruments at that show is way down. Instead of a couple dozen, there's 2. Gretsch, which the folks at the booth told me that they have hardly any goods in the warehouse. They're back ordered and don't have much, but they have more coming soon. And the Timberline showing Chinese-made harp guitars, which are quite nice, but the only reason they were there is the rep lives in Nashville, so he didn't have to spend any real money coming or setting up much. The industry is very much impacted, but there is still plenty of interest in guitars. In fact, if anything, we and other dealers are having difficulty getting enough of them. But anyway, going onward to questions that have come in. We have Jeff says, Matthew Larrivee answered an internet forum question a few days ago and included this comment, quote, they're slash and burning the hardwood forests in Central and South America, Asia, and Africa so fast it won't be long until half the tone woods we now consider industry standards won't be available except at ultra boutique prices. End quote. Then he goes on to say, I was under the impression that given your past answers on this topic, that you feel that the supply will last another 20 years at least, or am I mistaken? Well, I think that it depends on the supplies of which wood and where it's from. But if responsible forestry is practiced, there could be supplies for many years to come. However, places like Madagascar have many restrictions, but they're counterproductive in many ways. It's not legal to harvest and sell much of the wood or other products from Madagascar, but it's one of the poorest nations in the Eastern Hemisphere, and people are hungry, so it's perfectly legal for them to do slash and burn agriculture and try to grow crops to eat, but they don't have the ability to harvest wood that would be far more valuable, and which, if properly conserved, would keep them going. They could get more money from one log of tropical hardwood, such as Madagascar rosewood, than they would make in a year of their normal income. But as it is, they're not able to do sustainable harvest. But in many areas of the world, it's not a matter of ill-conceived international regulations. It really is poverty. But at any rate, it is true that rainforests and other natural habitats worldwide are being very rapidly depleted. And we are facing real problems. And another problem we're facing is climate change. When you get temperatures such as 114 degrees in Oregon, and there was one spot in British Columbia, Canada, that had 41 point, or it was 49.1 Celsius. It was 121 degrees Fahrenheit in British Columbia in one town, and they had fires that burned up an entire town. That has dramatic impacts on forests. Not only do they burn, but wildlife as well as people can't tolerate temperatures like that, and they just simply die. So we have numerous problems occurring that we are facing extreme calamities so far as wood sources. Even in the construction industry in the US for this home building, the price of construction lumber has nearly tripled in the last year. The wood supplies for guitars are not the same as for 2x4s for framing a house, but certainly supplies of lumber are limited. I have a friend who's in management at Mercedes, and he's in charge of the custom car division at the Vance, Alabama plant. And he was telling me that they're having difficulty getting exotic wood paneling for some of their custom order cars. And that these are problems they have not had in the past. So some of this is blowing up. Now, supplies of things like sinker mahogany, that is less impacted by bad forestry, because that was basically bad forestry practices of 100 to 150 years ago or more, but it resulted in wood at the bottom of rivers. That stuff is still around, and there may be enough to supply guitar making using that, at least on custom guitars, for several decades to come. But each year it does get more and more expensive to get at it, because the stuff that's easy to find is the first stuff that's brought up. And each year, what we are left with is wood that is deeper down or harder to find. But we're not anticipating being out of sinker mahogany for custom guitars in the coming 5 years. As far as a decade from now or 2 decades from now, it's hard to say. 2 decades seems like a long time in a manufacturing cycle, and a lot can change. But in the grand scheme of things, on a geological scale or on an ecological scale, 20 years is a short time. Rude Guitars has been in business for 51 and a half years. So, you know, back when I opened my shop, wood was much more readily available, but even then, Brazilian rosewood, although it was still legal and was not on the CITES Treaty, Appendix 1, until June 11th, 1992, it was getting increasingly hard to get, and also was regulated by the fact that the Brazilian government wanted wood that was only to be cut in Brazilian sawmills. They didn't want to simply sell logs, and companies like Martin were not interested in wood that was cut while still green. And therefore, that's why Martin switched back then from Brazilian rosewood to Indian rosewood in late 1969. at any rate, sources of wood are endangered. And it is true that within the coming decade, it's going to get more expensive to get good wood. It's already more expensive now than it was 10 years ago. And in the coming 10 years, price and availability is going to be more problematic. But with intelligent management, it would be possible to sustain it for much longer. Hopefully, people will take note of this because it's already becoming self-evident that if nothing is done, it's not just a matter of what happens with guitars, but when you see temperatures approaching 121 degrees Fahrenheit in British Columbia, that was breaking all records. But the point is, even in the far north of Canada, in the Yukon Territory, there were areas that had temperatures that hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not a sustainable situation. It can destroy forests and native wildlife and make areas also uninhabitable for people, coupled with the fact that rainfall in many areas now is greatly diminished, especially in the west of the US. So species of trees, animals, and people that depended on water now don't have enough. And people can move more easily than animals and plants, but we do have looming environmental serious issues. That doesn't necessarily answer everything that you may have asked, but do I think we'll have wood for another 20 years? Yes, but some of the species that we take for granted now will cost a whole lot more, and we'll have a whole lot less of it, and there will be more reliance on some alternative woods. Karsten asks, when I ask if a guitar has been exposed to extreme humidity and the rosewood fingerboard changes from original color to gray, what does that indicate? Is it too far gone? Well, it's likely to indicate that it has had such high humidity that it has been taken over by mold growth, and this wood may not be salvageable. But without seeing an individual instrument, it's hard for me to give a straight answer. First thing to do, of course, would be to clean it and see how deep this problem goes. In some cases, it may be possible to do a plane and refret, and you may have only a very, very thin layer of wood that is really so severely damaged. But rosewood should not turn gray. And if it does, something is severely wrong. Even being underwater for quite a while does not necessarily turn rosewood gray. So without seeing the instrument or the wood, I can't really comment further other than it sounds like that's not good. He also asks in an earlier question and answer that you stated that you compared a 1964 Stratocaster with a 1966 Stratocaster and noticed a significant difference. What similar comparison would you make with a Gibson? Would please compare a 56 Les Paul to a reissue Les Paul in 1968. Well, the difference in sound with the Fenders was really quite remarkable. Tom Holmes and I did some studies on that in the early 80s, in which Tom had an oscilloscope and he could do it would effectively give you a visual graph of the response, the frequency response from various pickups, and the difference in complexity of the signal on a given note on a Fender from 64 versus 66 was very notable. The 66 had a strong dominant and rather weak anemic harmonics, whereas the earlier pre-CBS pickup had a much fuller response of the harmonics, much more complexity, and much more volume of harmonics in proportion to the dominant signal. So it was really quite a different sound. Interestingly enough, the Gibson pickups did have some of the same that we noted, but not near as pronounced. The sound difference between a 1959 humbucking pickup, so far as the oscilloscope was concerned, was way less dramatic between that and a 1970s Gibson humbucking pickup. They weren't the same, and certainly our ear would also say that the patent applied for pickup had a richer, better sound, but the difference was not nearly as dramatic as on a Fender. So that is what I can say with regard to that particular question. When it comes down to the difference between 56 Les Paul to a reissue of 68, the 68 Les Paul was a surprisingly good guitar. It had an Indian rosewood fingerboard, whereas a 56 would have a Brazilian rosewood board. The binding in the cutaway was much deeper, thicker on the 68 reissue than it was on the original 56. Both had P90 pickups, but the P90 pickup of 56 was a bit hotter than the one from 68. The neck dimensions were surprisingly similar. The 68 was a pretty darn good guitar, actually, but it wasn't really the guitar that most players truly had wanted. Even in 68, it was abundantly evident that what players wanted was a copy of a 59 Sunburst Les Paul Standard, but that's not what Gibson made. And Gibson didn't even attempt to make anything like that until much later. But they also, in the two models they did issue in 68 were the Gold Top Standard and the Les Paul Custom, which they made with the fretless Wonder low frets, an ebony board, which is, they had the same basic ornamentation as they had in the 50s for the Les Paul Custom, but the humbucking pickup version of the Les Paul Custom in the 50s was a triple pickup guitar, whereas the reissue that they made in 68 was a two pickup guitar, which frankly most players did prefer two pickups. But the triple pickup model had the middle pickup wired so that when you hit that middle positions, the toggle switch, you got the middle pickup and the bridge pickup together, out of phase, super twangy. You didn't have a normal pickup selection of just rhythm pickup, neck pickup, and bridge pickup together. That was not one of the options on it. So it was a strange wiring system that most players didn't want, plus most players did not like the fretless Wonder low frets. So, but still, so far as sound, the 68 Les Paul was, to my ear, not as good sounding as the 56, but still pretty darn good. A lot better in that department, I would say, than the 1970s, 66 through into the 70s. The Fenders were not that great. Certainly the Fenders today are far better. Fender made much better guitars now than they did 50 years ago. And I have to say that they're coming remarkably close in quality to the pre-CBS models. I don't think they've quite equaled it, but they're remarkably close, especially in their custom shop instruments. They're very good guitars. There's another question that has come in from Jeff. Says that I've heard that Gibson Southern Jumbo circa 1942 with the skunk stripe was shipped primarily to southern states. Supposedly the stripe covers up a flaw in the top that would become worse in drier climates like northern states, so that they were shipped to southern states. Is this just more made up folklore? There were some during the wartime that had a black stripe down the center of the top, covering the center seam. And Joe Spann on my staff has spent over 40 years researching Gibson and has shipping ledger copies and an enormous amount of information, but it's still not complete in every regard. So what we can say, at least so far as Gibson's records show, is that the Gibson shipping ledgers do not separately and specifically identify which Southern jumbo guitars had the black center stripe in the top. So there's no way to answer this question on any empirical basis. We've also not seen any factory documentation from the period which would support this idea. Use of the skunk stripe begins late in the year 1942 and continued into early 44. But it was not consistent. Some had it, most didn't. So there's only 4 known batches with this skunk stripe. So each work order batch had a number, and so far 4 of the work order numbers are known to have this feature. But it frankly comes out that we feel it is highly unlikely that Gibson would have done this intentionally to ship to a specific area. It's more likely that Gibson was dealing with material shortages like every other guitar manufacturer during that period. Good materials were hard to get during the war. Had to make do with top blanks, which were not quite wide enough to use after being cut down. So they were hiding a design problem, but those guitars play well, they sound good, and we don't see anybody paying especially a different amount, either more or less, because of this feature. But describing cause, what were they thinking? Well, often enough decisions like this were not recorded, or at least if they were recorded on paper, the records were not saved and are not available now. And the people who made these decisions have one feature in common, and that is they'd be dead. And so there would be an extra long distance call to reach them to find out what they were thinking. We don't know. But what we do know is when they did it, how many work order batches seem to show this feature. So far as why they did it, we don't know. And since there's no evidence that they shipped them specifically to the southern states. But again, a lot of the ledgers just are not complete enough to give a straight answer to that question. Stephen says that he has a 1945 Martin single 018 with wartime brass frets. I was wondering if you could tell me what year Martin started using them and what year they stopped. And unfortunately, I don't have that answer right now. I will hopefully have that to do in our next session. And if you will send me an email to george@guitars.com, I will be happy to send you a personal answer to that question from me as soon as I have records on this. But I have not been able to get an answer from Martin today on that. They do have meticulously good records. But we can say that Greg Hutton, who has meticulous records, hasn't responded. John Arnold claims that Martin only used brass frets in the year 1945. That may be accurate, but I would want to confirm it. Based on experience on what I've seen, that's certainly plausible. But again, I would want to do a bit of further research, but I think it's pretty safe to say that it wasn't used for long. And 1945 is certainly a period when they did do some of that. But so far as did they do any in 44, I don't know. Have I ever seen one from 46 with that feature? No, I haven't. So that at least gives you some view of what we know on that at the moment. Um, now, another interesting question that we have gotten. Paul has attached photos showing two L4 oval hole arch tops, both of which have L5 style 14 fret neck to body joint. First shows a photo of British guitarist Horace Crady holding an example that is block inlaid fingerboard, a total of 23 frets, while the other guitar, serial number 87953, has a 2-octave fingerboard. The serial number of the second guitar indicates it was shipped in 31, by which time the L4 had 14 frets clear of the body and a round hole, but just 19 frets. In addition, the round hole model had a fingerboard with a square end, while both of these oval hole instruments here have the old style fingerboard with a pointed end, which is what L5s had. And here's the picture that he sent. One, block inlays. And here's the second one, the 2-octave fingerboard and an oval sound hole. And what our research states, and he's asked, in your opinion, were these instruments custom ordered by players wanting an oval hole guitar with the extended range offered by a 14 fret neck with extra frets, or were they prototypes built by Gibson with the view of introducing an arch top with a full 2-octave fingerboard, at the same time using up existing stock of obsolete oval bodies? Much more likely, from what we can see of many years of research of Gibson, that these were custom order instruments. And Gibson did indeed do custom orders, not in large quantities, but for the right price, they would make them. Gibson did not build a production version with a 2-octave fingerboard. And we have not seen either of these two guitars, but based on the photos, I see no reason to think that they are anything but original. But they do look like they were probably custom orders. Now, Gibson would have had oval hole bodies laying around, some that could easily have been used if somebody ordered one with a 14 fret neck and a longer fingerboard with more frets. You could fit more on with the oval hole than with a round hole. With a round hole, you have fingerboard extending over the sound hole edge, but with the oval hole, you could fit more frets in. That's including what Martin did on when they made a cutaway D20, or is it MC28? Was it not a D? It was an MC28 cutaway, 16-inch wide. They did it with a 24. It was an extra long fingerboard. It was let's see, 20. I believe it was a 22 fret board on that one, but they did it. They used 22 frets, but they did it with an oval sound hole, because if they had done it with a round hole, and the board would have extended over the edge of the sound hole. It was a 14 fret neck, and it was a 22 fret board, but an oval sound hole. With the oval sound hole, they were able to make a fingerboard that did not overlap the edge of the sound hole. And they put in an extra deep cutaway in that when Martin did it. Well, this shows that these are examples of custom orders from Gibson. They do not appear to be production models or prototypes built as a possibility of becoming a production model. They are almost certainly instruments that were custom ordered. Mike C. has said, I imagine with the position you're in, dealing with so many people with great guitars, you must have an awesome personal collection. Would you consider doing a show and share your collection with us? And thanks for taking time to tune in every week. Well, I think it is a good idea, and at some point I will probably do that. I'll take a video tour showing some of my personal collection. I have at times during these shows shown obviously items from my collection. Recently, for example, I showed the 1836 Martin, the 1842, the 1857, and the 1922, and explained some of the evolution, so that we do have instruments in the shop collection and my personal collection that do show a lot of the evolution of guitars, which is a subject that I find of considerable interest. Guitars do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in an environment based on musical trends, economical trends, technological trends, and sometimes just bean counting. All too often, decisions are made based on production cost rather than quality. At least they weren't so much in the old days that way, but they have been more starting in the mid-60s and definitely on through the 70s. A lot of the decisions were made not based on how to make a better guitar, but how to make a more economical product as far as cutting manufacturing costs and material and labor costs. And sometimes that was good, sometimes it was not. But if one thinks back on quality changes, there have been times of great innovation in this industry. Martin had their greatest creative streaks from the very late 1830s through the mid-1850s, when they went from the Stauffer style Germanic design to a more Spanish-oriented design, which became the basis of what became the modern Martin guitar, with a lot of modifications from Spanish design, but still based on peghead shapes, neck shapes, heel shape, ornamentation. A good bit of that came from early Spanish designs that Martin studied and then refined. But another great period in Martin's evolution was from the mid-1920s through the mid-1930s, when essentially the modern steel string guitar came into being. It was built on a framework of those earlier Spanish designed guitars, but the braces became heavier and they started using 14 fret necks on some models and OM as early as late 1929. And the solid peg head was actually the same peg head they'd been using with friction pegs for many years. In the earliest in the early 1840s, they had that type peg head on some guitars. But the point is, they still had a great deal of evolution in designs in that great creative period of mid-20s through mid-30s. And then another period of great creativity was not so much in the design of the guitars themselves, but in the manufacturing techniques, where they went from using power tools, but hand-guided, and a lot of hand tools, to a great deal of computer numeric control. And much of that happened from 1990 onward. Taylor was a great leader in that field, and still to this day, Taylor is one of the leaders in extremely fine machine work, but also computerization and really getting very high quality tolerances, very exacting tolerances with expert computer numeric control combined with human judgment in the design work process. Um, but at any rate, the methodology of building a guitar changed dramatically from the late 1980s onward to the present. The way in many of the designs may look very similar, but the manner in which they're built has changed dramatically. And it used to be that basically before CNC equipment, if you wanted to increase production, there were two things you could do. You could maybe you could hire more people, but typically if you hire more people, they weren't as well trained. If you want to get skilled labor, it's hard to just go out and find people who have years of skilled guitar making, handwork training, or you can cut corners and simplify the design. And the difference between a really fine guitar and you're using factory type heavy equipment, which if you're using it to make student model guitars, there's a limit to how good you can get it. The tolerances before CNC machines were not the same. And the handwork that went into finishing out that guitar, if it was a cheap student guitar, was not as good as on a more expensive guitar. It required more skilled labor. So guitars like Harmony or Kay, for their acoustics, had poorly fitted dovetail joints, and the routing for a truss rod was much cruder and frankly didn't work well. Whereas on a Gibson or Fender, truss rod actually worked. And the neck shapes were really much more sophisticated. But once you introduce CNC equipment, things change. If you program the machine so that it can cut to tolerances within 1,000th of an inch, it is really no more labor intensive to produce an elegantly fine neck shape than a rather crude one. Whereas when you're doing student models with heavy duty equipment, but still basically human driven rather than computer numeric driven, it's much more labor intensive to produce a neck that really works well. So that was a revolution in guitar building. But there was a revolution in the number of guitars being built, which in the 1960s accompanied the Beatles. And then the Rolling Stones and others, all of a sudden there was a demand for far more guitars. But this was before the advent of computer numeric controlled equipment. So using the same type equipment to produce more guitars, you could hire more people and try to work double shifts, but it was hard to get people with the necessary skills to do it well. Or it dumbed down the design. And that happened. And it's an interesting thing to look and see when the golden era periods were, and then to figure out what happened to cause those golden era periods to be as great as they were, but also to end when they did. And as far as the true golden era period in my mind for acoustic flat top guitars, as well as some of the great arch tops, was in the 1930s for steel string guitars. This was a period before World War II. The apprentice systems were very much in place. There were lots of skilled woodworkers and metal workers. The old style handcrafts were still very strong, and it was possible to hire skilled labor, but there was also a limited amount of it. Not everybody had these skills, but they still built great instruments. The greatest electric instruments tend to be from the 1950s. For Gibson, I think it's pretty clear that the ultimate year for Gibson Electrics, in the mind of most collectors, is 1959. The Sunburst Les Paul of 1959 was about as perfect as one can get. Conceivably, one could use better quality tuners than the Clouson Deluxe, and maybe the Tunematic Bridge could have been redesigned a little bit better so that the string saddles wouldn't go flying off if you changed the string, or if the string broke. But still, the guitar was great. The pickups were great. The neck was great. The truss rod worked. Everything about it was, they were wonderful guitars, and they bring more money than any others. And they had the right fret size, just everything about the guitar, it clicked. And that's true of virtually all the Gibson Electrics. 1959 would be a time when they were making the Flying V, the Explorer, the Sunburst Les Paul, the Dot 335. The iconic models were there. And the quality continued to be very good right on up through about the first quarter of 1965. And then, strangely enough, the quality pretty much took a nosedive at Gibson and at Fender and at virtually every other company. Gretsch, Fender, Guild, you name it, just about all of them. The ones they made before mid-1965 were great, and the ones that were made after were nowhere near as good. And what is there in common is that in the beginning of 1965, Fender was acquired by CBS. Guild was acquired by Avnet around 67, but the quality had already been falling before that. Gibson did not change ownership until 1970, when Norman acquired them, but Ted McCarty left. And the moment McCarty left, from then on, quality was compromised because the company was now taken over by bean counters, and not by people who had a background in engineering or manufacturing or music, but basically in cost accounting. And quality changed dramatically. That, coupled with an increased demand, it was the folk music boom of 59 to 63 was certainly that increased demand. And that, followed by the Beatles and Rolling Stones and others, the demand skyrocketed. And to produce more guitars, quality was compromised, and it was compromised with design changes, such that at Gibson, for example, by early 65, the Firebird guitars featured the neck through body construction, so-called reverse body shape, and the pickups were routed individually into the body, and there was a back plate for a control cavity on the back. And the Firebird 1, 3, 5, and 7 had distinctly different ornamentation. But after that, by mid-65, they changed. They came out with the so-called reverse, non-reverse body on the Firebirds. That changed things dramatically. And at that point, the guitar had a big swimming pool shaped route, where the pickups would go. You could put one pickup, two pickups, three pickups, it didn't matter. And the pickups and the electronics were all mounted to the pick guards. You just slap a different guard on, and the neck and body were identical thereafter on all of the models on the Firebirds. And it just differed in whether they had gold plating or chrome plating, or which pickups. The Firebird 1 and 3. Firebird 1 at that point had two P90s. Firebird 3 had three P90s. Firebird 5 had two mini humbuckers, Firebird style with no poles. And the Firebird 7 had three. Firebird 7 had gold plating. But the point is, the body and neck were the same. That's an example of the kind of cost cutting that was done. But it was amazing enough to me to look back and see that in one period of only 5 years, the quality went from being remarkably good enough that they're highly collectible to being some of the poorest quality in the history of most of the American manufacturers. And it happened basically at about the same time for Gibson and Fender and Guild and Gretsch and even for Martin. The quality changed, the designs changed, but there were management changes during this time. And more the companies were run by bean counters rather than engineers or people who were deeply involved in the music industry to the point of having experience playing and promoting music. And it changed in a way that I think was very detrimental to the guitar business. I'm pleased to say that today things are changing and have changed very considerably. Not only are changing, but have changed such that the new guitars made today are vastly better, but we still face challenges. Right now, many companies are back ordered severely, and dealers are having difficulty getting enough product. If a dealer orders new guitars from Martin today, most of those are not going to come in this year. And some of them might be 2023 before you get them. For Collings, some of the models are back ordered 2 years with no real guarantee exactly when they're going to come or exactly how much they're going to cost at that time. But they'll be priced at whatever they are at the time that they're shipped. But this is not a problem of simply one manufacturer. It's a problem that is industry-wide, and it is really quite a difficult situation. Also, even for import guitars, ports are backed up. Some containers are shipping out that would normally come in 3 weeks and now arrive but sit in the port for over a month before they get unloaded, or even tied up in customs and clearance. The costs of shipping have gone up dramatically. It used to be that to ship a container, 18-foot container from China to the US cost under $5,000, and now can be as much as $18,000 to ship the very same container that just a couple of years ago was way less. So material costs are up, material availability can be a problem. Shipping chains of supply, the whole supply chain in many cases is problematic. And there is an old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And with just-in-time manufacturing, when they run out of components, things just sit. Fortunately, for something like Martin guitars, they have a stockpile of wood good for several years. And most of the parts they use are still relatively readily available. They don't have a bunch of computer chips that they're waiting on like the car manufacturers, but automotive manufacturers have a real problem. Things are backed up because they cannot get some of the component parts. Fortunately, the guitar makers are still able to get the parts, but it is a problem. So, at any rate, that's what we can say. There are some real challenges facing our industry right now. But are business conditions relatively good for guitar makers? Well, they are profitable. So while stores may have trouble getting enough guitars, the ones that we are getting are good. And manufacturers are able to make the instruments profitably. They seem to sell very quickly when dealers get them. Manufacturers are not stuck in a position of having huge stockpiles. It was not very many years ago that Martin, Gibson, Fender, Taylor, and others were sitting on huge stockpiles in their warehouse of guitars for which they didn't have orders. Therefore, what I can say is that some of these problems may well be temporary. Costs of building materials for construction lumber are down, but costs of materials for guitar building and really fine grade hardwoods, tropical hardwoods, as well as high grade spruce are the problem. If you just look at the quality of the spruce on many guitars, you'll note that on the good guitars, they often will have 25 grain lines to the inch. And as I pointed out just last week, that means 25 grain lines to the inch. It took 25 years for it to grow an inch. It take 100 years for it to grow 4 inches. And if a top is 16 inches wide and you do a 2-piece top, that's 8 inches on each side. That's 200 years of growth to do that. And it needs a little more than that to have some extra room to, because sapwood doesn't get used. And some of the really dense hardwood doesn't match well either. So you don't necessarily get to use the entire log. This is a resource that is not going to grow in 20 years on a tree farm. So some woods can grow relatively quickly. Some of the tropical hardwoods actually grow quicker than the spruce. But the point is, there are shortages, but fortunately we can say that with good design, there are alternative woods that do work quite well. We're not going to completely run out of wood to make guitars and have to do only synthetics. That's not going to happen anytime soon. A few more questions have come in. Chuck Dennison says, how do you see the future of Martin guitars under new leadership? Well, it is true that Chris Martin has officially retired and is assuming the title of executive chairman, but he says that's going to be mostly for being a cheerleader. And the new CEO is a German man I have not yet met, but will be meeting next week. And I have considerable hopes that he will be a good CEO. He has experience playing music since his teenage years. And he even took a sabbatical of a year to learn guitar making before ever being considered for a job at Martin. So he's interested in guitars. He knows business and guitars. So some of the dire predictions I might have been making about bean counters may not apply. So, and I can also say that the management at Taylor is extremely good. Bob and Kurt at Taylor and Andy Powers at Taylor are very knowledgeable, very skilled. Their employees are well compensated, have employee ownership of the company through stocks. And I feel that the future for Taylor is very good. I have high hopes for the future of Martin. And we'll see what happens under the new Gibson team. But they certainly are uh, definitely recruiting some people who know about guitars. So there's no question that the management that is in place today at the major manufacturers is actually far better than it was during the mid to late 60s through the early 1980s. I would say that it's far better today, even on import guitars, such as the Gretsch guitars. Talking to some of the people who are involved with Gretsch, they're quite knowledgeable about guitars. They actually care about guitars. They've been studying them and talking to musicians, and they're really coming out with instruments that, although they may be imports, are very carefully thought out, and that they are getting input from people who definitely know what they're talking about. So they are hiring people who are skilled, and they're conferring with musicians as well. Uh, John Nitsopoulos says he has a guild, Nightbird GG 1985. I was just wondering how many were made. Anything else you can say? I don't have the exact production totals in front of me. It wasn't very many, but actually there is a, rather than telling you, trying to guess at it, I can tell you if you simply go to the Guild website, they have Guild serial number lists right on their website. And they do have the serial numbers organized in such a manner that you can tell which model. Guild had different serial number sequences for various models, so that unlike Martin, which had consecutive serial numbers, such that you can tell how many they made in a year, but you can't tell from the number exactly, just from the number alone, what model it is. With Guild's, each model for quite a bit of its history had its own number sequence, and the Nightbirds were like that. If you go to the Guild website, you can look it up and you can see for yourself quite easily exactly how many were made each year. And it wasn't very many. They are, in my opinion, some of the best electric guitars Guild ever made. And 85 was the first year for that model. So that would be a guitar that, as Guilds go, would be about as collectible as any of the electrics they did, and would be a very good quality guitar. Kent Waltham says, I have recently purchased a 1942 Martin D18, which has an oversized pickguard. It looks suspiciously like it was done by Martin. The material looks right. It's well done. Did Martin put large guards on guitars? And if so, how can a person tell? Well, yes, they did a few large guards on special order. If you send me photos, I can offer an opinion, but also if you contact me with the photos and a serial number, I can check through Martin Records and find out if it shows anything in the foreman's notes about it being a custom order. Martin's records are meticulously good. And this is something that, since I don't have a photo, I don't have an immediate opinion. Is it possible? The answer is yes. Was it common at that time? The answer is no, but it is still possible. And with photos and a serial number, if you send that to me, george@guitars.com, I will definitely be able to offer an opinion. And possibly better than just an opinion, I may be able to have absolute proof via factory records. For Neil Kotke, Coty, K-O-T-E-Y. Do you think Fender and Gibson will continue to dominate the market, or do you think eventually other companies with good product, sound, and build quality will become the new holy grail of guitars? If so, what are the companies or guitars to watch? Simple question to ask and a difficult one to answer. As far as, and this is also, I'm assuming you're talking about electric guitars rather than acoustics, since you didn't mention Martin Taylor. When it comes to acoustics, I think Martin, Gibson, Taylor, Santa Cruz, Collings are going to continue to be important. And as far as who's going to come along to really contest them for a top position, there are some small makers, Preston Thompson, Santa Cruz, boutique makers, but most of those aren't really trying to become big factories. So will some of them become collectible? I think undoubtedly that is possible. What human hands could do in the past, there's no reason why they can't do it now. Materials may be more scarce, but they're not impossible to get for an individual handcrafter. It is certainly possible to get good quality wood. Maybe not large container loads of it, but for a maker like Monteleone, he doesn't need container loads of wood. If he's only making 10 or 12 guitars a year, he doesn't need a huge stockpile. But certainly he makes very fine guitars. His guitars in particular, I think, are not priced where working musicians can afford them, but they're still great guitars. But will Fender and Gibson continue to play a very strong role? I think absolutely yes. But in the distant future, if you're going to talk about 20 years in the future, somebody can come along and be an important player. Fender, when they started out in '46, were a small-time company, but it didn't take very long at all for them to play a very serious role in this industry. Can somebody else come along and be a powerhouse? Yes, and Taylor didn't come along till 1974. It took a long time by the standards of somebody who's, well, if you're my age, it seemed like it took a long time for them to start really rivaling Martin, but in fact, it wasn't all that many years. 1974, they were a tiny little company making only a few guitars. Today, Taylor makes 200 plus a day in their US factory, sometimes seven or even 800 a day in their Mexican factory, but that's including things like Baby Taylors or GS Minis that are lower budget price, but some of the stuff from the Mexican factory is beautifully crafted. Model 200 guitars, for example, made in Mexico, are beautifully done and look very similar to the US product. They're laminated back and sides, but they sure look and sound a whole lot like the US product. There's room for more to come. So far as Michael Cruz asks me to comment on Fender Stratocaster cases, different eras of black cases and tweed cases. Well, obviously, it's great to have the original case. And the tweed cases typically are more expensive than the later black cases, but the later black cases came around as early as the mid-'60s, so they should, the right case with the guitar. Putting a tweed case with a guitar that's from a different era is in some ways sort of a waste. It's best to have the original type case for a collector. From a musician's standpoint, I think if you have a beautiful condition original case, you're probably better off, if you're going to travel with the guitar, to use a different case and leave the original one at home and just keep it pristine, because they get beat up real easily. And the original hard shells with the tweed covering, it was cloth covering, or the black ones with the leatherette covering, those coverings don't really wear near as well as some modern light cases, cases by Hoffy or Calton or a variety of others. I suggest leaving the original case at home and do that. But at any rate, yes, cases do contribute to the value of the guitar, but I'm more concerned about having a really fine guitar. Uh, Having an original case definitely can enhance value, but it does not diminish the collectible appeal of a guitar if it doesn't have the case. The guitar is still worth just as much as ever, but I would say that if it doesn't have the case, at least it deducts from the resale value by as much as the cost of a case. But keep in mind, the case wasn't made specifically for that guitar. You know, Martin guitar, when it's in process, all the parts are mated together for that guitar. The cases were bought, not made by Martin. And the same Fender. Fender doesn't make cases, they buy cases. And they may be proprietary cases made to their specs, but they are cases that they bought, not cases that they made. So if your guitar doesn't have an original case and you find somebody who is selling the right case, if you put that right case with the guitar, it's not going to impact the value any more than if it was bought new with that case, because they are indistinguishable. It's just like a tuning gear. If a tuning gear goes bad and you replace it with the identical brand, the identical gear, the identical model tuner, Martin, Fender, Gibson, etc., they did not make tuning gears. They bought them. There are companies such as, for example, Gibson banjos. They didn't make their own metal hardware, but it was made specifically for them. They are proprietary parts, but the manufacturer made them for nobody else. So it is still possible sometimes to find such a part, but it can be difficult. But aftermarket parts made by a different manufacturer will reduce value, but still may be highly functional. If one is replacing tuners, if you replace them with gears that are not the original manufacturer, but still have the exact same footprint, such as, for example, replacing pre-World War II Rover gears with Waverly gears that are built as replicas, but built to higher standards, where they actually have a better gear ratio and they're truly better made. If you, all you're doing is unscrewing the old one, screwing on the new one, and you can convert it right back if you ever wish. If you save the original components, that's an example of a modification you can do that will not reduce value. But anything that is irreversible will reduce value. And that's the kind of thing we do not advise doing. If you have a collectible guitar that's worth a lot of money and it doesn't do the things you want to do, rather than hot rodding it, you'd be better off to have somebody build you a guitar that has the specs you want and keep the other one. If it's in collectible condition, keep it original, because you don't want to take a guitar that's worth $40,000 or $50,000 and make it suit your playing better, except that you cut the value to 1/3 of what it was before. Why pay good money to make your guitar worth 1/3 as much? If you want a Fender guitar with a Floyd Rose system on it, or with active electronics and needing battery compartment, whatever, don't do that to your 1954 Strat or your 57 Strat or even your 1964 Strat. It's still pre-CBS. It's keep those as original as is possible. And if they get scratched up, don't strip off original finish. Don't customize them with your name in big bold inlaid letters or carved in. That's just not the thing to do. These are historically significant pieces that should be preserved. with proper care, they will last for generations. At any rate, that covers today's questions. Spent a fair amount of time expounding on some of my views on where the market has been and where it could be going. But keep in mind that sort of the Yogi Berra type statement, predictions are really hard because they're about the future and it hasn't happened yet. And it's a whole lot easier to have really excellent hindsight than it is to figure out exactly where things are going. But I feel hopeful that we are in a period that is not like 1965 through 1970, where quality goes way, way down fast. But we are at a time when availability of environmentally sensitive wood is increasingly a problem. We are at a time when cost of transportation is higher. We are at a time when prices are not stable for either used, vintage, or new instruments. If you just look at the cost to make a guitar in China, it's way more now than it was even 5 years ago. And the cost of transportation to get it here is way more now than it was even 2 years ago. And even the cost within the USA of shipping packages by FedEx or UPS is considerably up in the past year. So we have environmental concerns, we have economic concerns, the rate of inflation in our economy is also a matter of concern, and the health of our economy is definitely less certain to me, and the rate of inflation is not, in my opinion, what the government claims it to be. We're not at 2%. And the figures for how much inflation has been even over the past 50 years or more is not necessarily the same as the government official statistics. If you look at what a Martin guitar costs in 1936 versus today, it didn't go up by 25 or 30. It's gone up more like by a factor of multiplied by 60. But even there, it's not quite the same guitar. A D28 Martin was $100 in 1936. Today, the authentic series is over $8,000 list price. And it's a good guitar, but it's not the same as the 1936. Doesn't have Brazilian rosewood. It's got Madagascar rosewood, which is not as good sounding. Times have changed. I keep thinking of the sort of inflation figures too. When you're in recession, in 2008, there was a tremendous recession that hit. But in 2007, mid-year, I could see already that many instrument prices were stagnating. But the US government declared in September of 2008 that we didn't yet have enough information to know if we were in recession. But by October, they said, yes, by golly, it is a recession, but it started a year ago. So I'll leave it with that happy note. The fact is, right now, the quality of new guitars being made by major manufacturers worldwide is some of the best it's been in at least 60 years. So that's a very positive sign. Music stores are able to sell what they get. Manufacturers are able to sell what they make. Customers do want guitars. So there's some very positive things going on. We have environmental and other issues to work on, There's numerous problems, but there's always going to be problems. But right now, I'm hopeful that business conditions are way better now than they were 10 years ago. Guitar sales are good, demand is strong, and we have, when demand is strong, there's an incentive to solve the problems. So we got plenty to work on and a good bit to look forward to. But keep in mind, next week, NAMM is in Nashville, and I will not be doing a question and answer session next week, but we will be back the following week. Till then, have a good one.